Hey folks, Josh here from Last Breath Woodworks. In this video, we're going to be going over a project that I made for my daughter's wedding reception this past weekend. Now, it seems that traditional wedding cakes are a thing of the past, and now the new craze is cupcakes. So we're going to be making a cupcake display stand. I started by milling down some 4/4 ash and red oak to 3/4 and then rip them into 1.5-inch strips. Once I had the pieces laid out the way I wanted, I marked them before the glue up so that I could keep the configuration in the right line. This is because the top and bottom of each segment or layer of the display comes from the same board of ash, and then there's a red oak strip through the middle. So these lines will help me keep that grain in alignment. Now, there's only going to be 3 tiers to this stand, but you may notice that there are 4 sections or 4 separate glue-ups of the boards. This is because I want the grain to wrap around continuously, but an 8-foot board wasn't long enough for some of the bigger boxes. Therefore, I decided to do the front 3 sides with one board and then create a separate set of boards or panel for the back side that wouldn't show anyway. Now, what you'll see here is that I'm gluing these up with a roller. That's just a small paint roller that I keep stored in a Ziploc freezer bag with a little extra glue in it to keep it moist, keep it from drying out. It works great. Now I can actually put all these panels together because there's no glue in between the individual panels. Now that they're in place, I installed some cawls to keep them flat, and it's time to clamp them down. Once everything was clamped up tight, it was time to let them rest overnight, let the glue dry, and I'll get to them in the morning. The next morning, I took all the panels out of the clamps and proceeded to clean off all the glue squeeze up. Here I'm just using a standard paint scraper to knock off all the little beads of glue. Now I didn't wipe off the glue after clamping because with open grain woods like red oak, doing that could squeeze glue down into the open pores and grains of the wood and ruin the finish later on. I then sanded quick with 80 grit to knock off any edges, and then took a pencil and scribbled a line down both sides to make sure that everything was planed down smooth later on. I then proceeded to plane all the panels down to 5/8 of an inch thick. Now that my panels were planed smooth and equal thickness, it was time to cut my box sides to length. Now, since I'm doing mitered corners, these cuts have to be precise, so I decided to use my crosscut sled. I measured each piece individually, that way I didn't have to worry about accounting for the kerf later on. As I cut each piece to its length, I labeled the ends A through D and put an arrow pointing up so that I could keep them in the right configuration later. Once I had my 3 sides that show cut out of the one panel, I grabbed that extra panel I made to cut the back side. With all the pieces cut to length for all 3 tiers, it was time to use a miter sled that I made to just cut those 45s on the end of each piece. Next step was to take each piece and put an 1/8 inch round over on the top inside edge. Once I had every one of them done that way, I switched out the bits and cut a dado for my plywood top to sit inside of. Finally, it was time to assemble the boxes. I started by lining them all up and putting tape at each joint, which would act as a hinge and clamp during assembly. Then I flipped them all over and put tape next to each joint. I found this helps to prevent the squeeze out from becoming too messy on the inside of the box. Then I brushed in a nice coat of Titebond 2 into each joint and put a bead down the dado. Install the plywood, fold it all together, clamp it up, and check for square. After the glue had dried, I took all 3 boxes back to the router table and put a 1/4 inch round over on the top outside edge. Now it was time to add some splines to the corners of each box. I marked a line on one side to align it, clamped a block on one side to keep that measurement true, and proceeded to cut the splines on both sides. I decided to go with dovetail splines so that it matched the card box that my daughter helped me make a couple months ago. Using the same dovetail bit, I set up my fence and a feather board and used some of the scrap red oak that I had from cutoffs to make my spline material. You can see I raised up that feather board so that it pushes firmly against the flat part of the board and not against what I had cut. This will prevent tipping as it goes through with just the force pushing directly against the fence. I continued taking light passes, checking the fit after each pass until I had a nice snug joint. I used the table saw to rip those splines off of those pieces and then chop them at the miter saw to about 1.5 inches long. Then applied glue to both the box and the splines and tapped them into place. Once the glue had dried, I cut all the splines off and then sanded all the boxes down and got them ready for finish. I used an index card as just a kind of guide to keep me from cutting too close and gouging into the box. Now, there was a couple steps that I forgot to record, and they were using the dado stack on my table saw. I ripped off a little bit on the back of the top 2 tiers so that it would rest over the top of the lip on the ones below it. I then centered each piece and used a saw to cut a little mark on the back of the bottom 2 pieces for easy alignment when setting up. This leaves a 4-inch lip all the way around on each shelf. And there we have it, finished product.